HTML, you can apply transforms to fix projector issues. So, before I go into the CSS part of this talk, I should introduce myself. I'm Lea Verou. I'm a CSS working group invited expert, and I'm writing a book for O'Reilly. It's going to be called CSS Secrets, and it's going to come out in 2014. And until the end of July, I used to work full-time at W3C. If you've ever heard my name before, it's probably because of one of my open source projects. The most popular of which are Prism, a syntax highlighter used in many big websites. Doublet, which is an online CSS, HTML, JavaScript playground. Prefix Free, which is a library you can drop in your pages, and you won't need to write CSS prefixes anymore. And many others that you can find in my website or my GitHub profile. So, and this is Mr. Border Radius. So when I first started making this talk, I wondered, how would border radius look if it was a character? Because I had this crazy idea about designing some cartoon character that looked like border radius, whatever border radius would be. And I figured it would look like this shy, reserved character in children's books that everybody thinks they're uncool and nobody wants to hang out with them. And then eventually they save the day. Because I think that's a bit how border radius is in CSS. Nobody appreciates border radius. Nobody thinks much of border radius. Nobody thinks border radius is cool. You can just run the corners, right? So, you might be surprised, but let's first see the very basic use case of border radius. You give it a value, it rounds the corners. If you increase the value, the rounding increases. And the number you specify stands for the radius of a circle, if you put that circle in each of the corners. So, as you might know, border radius has very good browser support. It's supported by every browser out there today. You don't even need to use prefixes anymore in WebKit and Mozilla. You never needed to use prefixes in Opera or IE. Anybody that's writing O border radius or MS border radius is just bloating their CSS for no reason, because you don't need these prefixes. It's also supported very well on mobile. And yeah, what else is there to know about border radius? Goodbye. Oh, wait a second. If that's all there is to border radius, why do we need 6 pages in the specification? To explain just what I just said? That could be explained in 1 page. Why do we need all of those? So it turns out there are many other things border radius can do that many people haven't looked into. The first one is that we can specify different radius per corner. Have you ever tried specifying multiple lengths here? So instead of just 1 length, how about 2 lengths? As you can see now, each of those numbers controls 2 different corners, 2 opposite corners. The first one controls the top left corner and the bottom right corner. And the second one controls the top right corner and the bottom left corner. But it doesn't stop there. You can even provide 3 numbers. And then each of those, and then the first and the third number control only 1 corner. But the second number still controls these 2 opposite corners. And of course, you can provide 4 numbers, and then each of those controls its own corner. It goes clockwise starting from the top left. So as you can see, each number now controls only 1 corner. So let's assume we wanted to do something like this. To have an 80 pixels corner in every corner except the bottom left. That's a bit repetitive. We have to repeat 3 numbers in our code. So if we ever want to change this to 60 instead of 80, we have to do it 3 times. And that's tedious. We don't want to be doing that. So can we minimize the repetition a bit? The good thing is the border radius comes with a number of longhand properties as well. So in this case, we can do this. Border bottom left radius, 0. And we can just say, I want all corners to be 60 pixels except the bottom left. And it works the same, but if we ever want to change the corner, we just change it in one place. Here's a summary of how this works. When you have two numbers, each of those control two opposite corners. When you have three numbers, the second number controls two opposite corners. And when you have four numbers, each of them controls one corner. So you might have done this already. But here's a very interesting fact about border radius that many people miss. According to what I told you earlier, here we have a top left corner that's 900 pixels, and all the other corners are 90 pixels. If you remember, this works in exactly the same way as this, so we don't need this. But can you notice something? The width is 440, and the height is 220. So if we wanted to fit this border radius, we would need a width of at least 990 pixels. So the border radius we specified just doesn't fit here. So what should a browser do in this case? There are two options. There are two reasonable options that browsers could do. They could decide to just scale down this and apply the 90 pixels the way they are. But the problem is, the relative ratio between the corners would change. So what the CSS working group decided to do in these cases is that every single corner is scaled down. So in this case, if I change the border radius to 2,900 pixels instead of 900, you can notice that it's not just the top left corner that changes. Every corner changes. Pay attention to the other corners, the smaller ones. All of them change, even though I'm not changing their values, they're still 90 pixels. And they're changing because the ratio between them changes. 90 to 900 is a very different ratio than 90 to 2,900. And if we take a closer look, in our original example, the radius that's applied is actually 381 pixels. It's not 900. And same with the other corners, 38 pixels. So as you can see, the ratio between them is the same. The other corners are still 1/10 of the big one, but the absolute values are different. In the language of the spec, this is written as, when the sum of any two adjacent border radii, adjacent means they're next to each other, exceeds the size of the border box, UAs must proportionally reduce the used values of all border radii until none of them overlap. So I know this might sound a bit confusing, so just keep in mind what I told you. If it doesn't fit, all of the curves are scaled down, not just the one that doesn't fit, all of them. If you find maths easier to understand, that's how it looks. That's just for one corner. And what we just learned in this section is that we can have different radiuses per corner in clockwise order. Separate properties for every corner are available, like border top right radius or border bottom left radius or whatever. And most importantly, if the sum of two adjacent radiuses exceeds the length of their side, they're reduced proportionally. So here's a cool demo somebody made, and basically the main idea behind this demo is all the number of different shapes we can do without even learning anything more about border radius. Just with what we saw already. You can make circles, you can make this sort of shape, or it just, as many tiles as we click, the shape changes. And we can make all sorts of, shapes. Yeah, any kind of shape. So, any kind of shape. So, moving on to the next demo, here we wanted to make an ellipse. An ellipse is this sort of shape. And we tried,
by specifying a large border radius, but it doesn't work. And it doesn't work with any of the things we've mentioned so far. I can specify a smaller border radius, and you can see what happens, but it won't go above 210. And why doesn't it go above 210? Because that's half our height. And it cannot be larger than half our height, because all of them need to be the same. So all of them will be scaled down, because we want to maintain that. We still want all 4 radii to be the same. So we can't make an ellipse by just specifying, sorry, my address bar showed again. Okay. So we cannot make an ellipse just by specifying one value for the border radius. But here comes another thing that many people don't know about border radius. Border radius accepts different radius horizontally and vertically if you use a slash to separate the two. So this is equivalent to what we had before because they're both the same. But now we can start adjusting this independently. So as you can see, now our shape became an ellipse because our horizontal radius is half our width and our vertical radius is half our height. So there we have it, that's an ellipse. There's one problem though, and some of you might have started to see it. This works for these dimensions. What if our dimensions change? What if our width becomes bigger? Or what if our height becomes smaller? That's not an ellipse anymore. That's a weird sausage-like shape. So, of course, we could adjust it again, and we could specify like 380 here and 170 here, and it's still an ellipse again. But then the dimensions could change again for whatever reason. It's CSS. Anything might change. And now it broke again. It's not an ellipse anymore. It's a weird cylinder-like shape. So we could tweak the values again, but is this how we want to be spending our time? Every time we change the dimensions, we change the border radius as well? And what if the content is dynamic? Then we can't specify half of our height because we don't know what our height will be. So does that mean we can't make an ellipse in those cases? Actually, there's a better way to create an ellipse. Instead of manually specifying half our width and half our height, we can say 50%. And that will just automatically mean half our width. And we can say 50% horizontally, and that will mean half our height. And even though these two values resolve to different things, because they are the same specified value, we can even get rid of the slash and just say border radius 50%. And now, no matter what dimensions we have, it will still work. It will still be an ellipse, even in the weirdest of dimensions. And obviously, if the height is the same as the width, you'll have a circle instead of an ellipse, which is what we want in most cases. This is a circle now. So now we know we can make an ellipse. Can we make half an ellipse? Just with border radius? Is it possible? So let's see. Let's think for a bit. What is half an ellipse? If we view it as a rectangle with border radius applied, it has an equal horizontal and vertical horizontal radius in the top two corners, in the top left and the top right corner. The horizontal radius is the same. And since there are no straight edges, it follows that it will be like 50%. Vertically, there's no radius in the bottom corners, and the radius of the top corners occupies the entire height of the element. So it makes sense to try 100% vertically for the top corners and 0 for the bottom corners. So let's try doing that. 50% horizontally, then 100% for the top two corners, and 0 for the bottom corners. And there you have it, half an ellipse. And the good thing is, we can even adjust the dimensions, the width and height, and it's still half an ellipse. And if the height is half the width, then you have a semicircle, half a circle, instead of half an ellipse. So we can also do half an ellipse. Can we do a quarter ellipse? Let's think about that too. So a quarter ellipse would be the curve of the top right corner occupies the entire width and height of the element, both horizontally and vertically, and the other corners have a radius of 0. So, horizontally, we have 0 at the top left corner, 100% at the top right corner, and 0 at the other corners. And vertically, it would be the same, 0 at the top left corner and bottom left corner and bottom right corner, and 100% at the top right corner. And since these two are now the same, we don't even need the slash anymore. So it's just this. And we can even make different quarter ellipses by changing where the 100% is. Like, you can do this, all sorts of things. And then again, that also adjusts to the dimensions we have, whatever they are. So now we know we can make a quarter ellipse. Can we make 1/8 of an ellipse? Or 1/3 of an ellipse? No, sorry. So here's a summary of how the slash works. You can specify multiple values before and after the slash as well. You can specify up to 8 values if you use the full expanded form of border radius. You can specify 4 values before the slash, 4 values after the slash. Usually you don't have to. But this is how it will work. And if you want to specify different horizontal and vertical radius in the longhands, you don't use a slash. You just use white space. So a recap of what we just learned in this section. We can have different horizontal and vertical radiuses, in which case our corner curves become elliptical and not circular. They're parts of ellipses, not parts of a circle. Percentages in border radius refer to the corresponding dimension, which means horizontally, they are percentages of the width. Vertically, they're percentages of the height. Border radius can take up to 8 lengths if you use the full expanded form. And when either the vertical or the horizontal radius of a corner is 0, there is no rounding in either of the two. You can't have a corner that's, 40 pixels horizontally and 0 vertically. How would you draw that? And this is a very nice demo to prove that all this complexity in border radius, it's not intellectual masturbation of the CSS working group. It's actually useful. So here, Simurai created these nice buttons, and he used everything I showed you so far. Elliptical curves, different radiuses per corner, combination of the two, and they're very flexible as well. You can change their colors and all sorts of things. And here's another demo that's less useful, but it's still kind of fun. Somebody used border radius to create creatures with CSS. And they're even animated. And here's a website I made several years ago. And I used different border radius values to create these buttons here to look like pebbles. And each of them has different values so that they appear random in here as well. So have you ever wondered why border radius is called border radius and not corner radius? What does it have to do with borders? It works without borders as well. So why is border in the name? Who has ever wondered about that? Okay, not many. Well, I had. So the reason it's called border radius is that it rounds, when you have a border, it rounds the outer edge of the element, not the inner edge. So here, we have a border radius of 40 pixels, and you can see that the rounding that's 40 pixels is the outer edge. The inner edge is smaller. How smaller? This value minus our border width. So if we increase our border width, it becomes smaller. Obviously, it cannot be negative. So here it would be minus 10, but it's effectively 0. And if we increase this, obviously the inner rounding increases as well. This is the wording, this is how this is phrased in the specification. The padding edge inner border radius is the outer border radius minus the corresponding border thickness. In the case where this results in a negative value, the inner radius is 0. Although, even though naming it border radius did have a reason, most people in the CSS working group would agree today that it was a bad idea, and it should be named corner radius. But oh well, we're stuck with it now. And yeah, this is how it looks in MATS, if you find that easier to understand. So given what I said before, that also applies in cases where you have different border widths. So here we've specified a border radius of 40 pixels, which means the outer edge is 40 pixels, but the inner edge is irregular. The inner rounding is elliptical. It's part of an ellipse. It's not part of a circle. The vertical radius is bigger than the horizontal radius. So in cases where we don't care, that should be fine. But what if we want the inner radius to be circular and we don't care about the outer radius? We can kind of hack it by overriding the border radius for that corner and specifying a larger horizontal radius so that it overcomes the difference in the borders. Here, our right border is 20 pixels. Our top border is 10 pixels. So we have a difference of 10 pixels we need to cover. So we will specify our horizontal radius to be 10 pixels larger. So we will specify a horizontal radius of 50 pixels and a vertical radius of 40 pixels. And there we have it. Now the inner radius is circular, and obviously now the outer radius is elliptical. So depending on our use case, this may or may not be what we want. But it's good to know how to do it in case it is what we want. Also, we might want to have different colors. So here, both our borders are this color. But let's specify a different top color and a different right color. because, for example, we wanted to do some sort of 3D effect or whatever. An important thing to notice is that the difference between these two colors is abrupt. It's not gradual. It's just a diagonal, abrupt change from black to this sort of brownish color. And the border radius does not affect the angle of this. I can change the border radius as much as I want, and the angle will stay the same. The only thing that changes the angle is if we change the border thickness. And obviously, if our borders are the same width everywhere, this angle is 45 degrees. And actually, this can be useful for some things. Or even if it's not useful, it can be fun. So we can do something like this. Not very useful, but I think it's kind of fun. So a recap of what we just learned. Border radius rounds the outer border edge. The inner border radius will be smaller. How smaller? As much as our border width. Even with a circular radius, the inner radius might be elliptical if different border widths are involved, which we saw how we can overcome by manually specifying an elliptical border radius. And if the borders have different colors, the transition between them will be abrupt and diagonal, and it will only depend on the borders we have, not on the border radius. So we saw how border radius interacts with borders, but how does it interact with other properties, such as shadows or outlines? So here we have, oh, there's a stool here. That's interesting. I can sit. That's comfortable. So here we have a shadow. Let's decrease the blur a bit so you can see what's happening. And let's move it a bit over there. It won't look pretty, but it's better to see what's going on here. So as you can see, the shadow has the same rounding as our border radius value. If we increase this, the shadow's rounding increases as well. An interesting thing to note is that if our box shadow has a spread value, like this, something to make it smaller, then its radius will decrease. For example, here our border radius is 50, but the rounding here is 20. And now it's 10, and now it's 0, because 50 minus 50. And obviously now it's 0 as well, because it can't be negative. And if the spread is positive, the rounding increases. So now our border radius is 50, but our shadow's rounding is 30. Oops. So box shadow follows border radius as well as it possibly could. What about other properties? What about outline? Because, I mean, borders are fine, but sometimes you might want to use outline because you might want a second sort of border, or because you want a border that doesn't affect layout. So in these cases, we usually use outline. But if we try to do this here, you can see that it doesn't follow our radius. It's just rectangular. And that's not a bug. That's how it's supposed to work. So there are two ways to overcome this. One of them is horrible, but I will show it to you anyway. It's proprietary. It's a Mohs outline radius property, and it's horrible for a number of reasons. A, it only works in Firefox. B, it requires you to manually calculate what radius you should specify, because 50 pixels won't work here. We need to specify the outer radius. So it will be 50 pixels plus 10. So it's 60. So yeah, outline radius is a profoundly bad idea. Don't use it. Thankfully, there's something better we can do. It might seem a bit hacky, but it's actually better. We can use box shadow, which we know follows the border radius properly, specify 0 offsets, 0 blur, a positive spread, and whatever color we want. And this works in exactly the way we want. We don't need to make any calculations whatsoever, and it works in any browser supporting box shadow, which is pretty good browser support. So to recap, box shadow follows the curves of border radius. Box shadow spread adds to border radius, which means if it's negative, it subtracts from the border radius. Outlines are always rectangular, and you can emulate rounded outlines with box shadow that has 0 offsets and 0 blur and a positive spread radius. So here's an interesting point to note about border radius. It doesn't affect text wrapping, which looks worse and worse the bigger your border radius gets. There's no easy way around this, unfortunately. One way to get around it would be to specify overflow hidden, but that's horrible. We can't read our text anymore. So that won't work. We can specify padding, and that kind of works, but it mostly works for smaller radii, like when it's like this. When you get really big radii, you need huge padding to make it work, and you end up with a very tiny area of text. There is a way you can make this work, but that's more of a thing we will be able to do in the future. It's not something you can do now, but I still think it's kind of interesting. So there was a CSS module called CSS Shapes. I mean, it still exists. And it's about wrapping text inside or around different kinds of shapes that aren't just rectangles. And it used to define this property called shape inside, which works in Chrome, but even though shape inside works in Chrome, it was removed from the specification, and it will be added again in level 2. So it will be a while before we see other implementations. So the only case I can imagine this being useful is something that's Chrome only or WebKit only. And it's also pretty horrible in syntax. You specify a function and offsets from the top left, width, height, and rounding twice. Because you need to specify horizontal or vertical rounding. This will not work. You need to specify it again for some reason. And 50-50, that should work. I have no idea why this is not working. Maybe something weird in Chrome Canary. Nope. Oh, wait. Yeah, it must be something weird in Chrome Canary. So, as you can see, it is working here, but the overflow is still kind of weird, because it doesn't fit in the box we had. Also, if we have padding, it doesn't naturally follow the padding. Wait a second, I should go full screen. It doesn't naturally follow the padding. Which is seen even more clearly with a larger radius. Or maybe not. So if we have a padding of 20 pixels, yeah, you can see it now. The rounding here is not what it should be. It should be 60, but it's still 80 because we manually specified it. So we still need to do manual calculations that way. Not to mention, it's very buggy because it's an experimental implementation. So if we use box sizing here as well, because we don't want our padding to be added in our width, it goes all weird. It just stops working. It gives up. At least here. It works here, but yeah, it's really buggy and horrible. But I still thought it's kind of interesting to show. So border radius does not affect text wrapping, unfortunately. I don't know why they did that. Probably because it's easier for browsers. Overflow hidden follows the rounding, kind of, but clips text, so useless. Padding can help when you have small radii. And CSS shapes level 2 will solve this, but clumsily. As you saw, the syntax is horrible, and you need to specify the radius twice, and you need to make calculations on your own, but it's something. Also, have you ever thought that border radius accepts lengths and percentages? Both of these values are animatable. So basically, even though most people don't do it, we can actually do animations on border radius. Here's a kind of pointless example. It's a radius of 20, and when I hover, it becomes 200. Or I could do something like this. So when I hover over and out of it, it seems like it's kind of dancing. And I can also do keyframe animations, not just transitions. So let's make a silly animation here to so I want to have a radius that's half an ellipse, which, as we saw earlier, would be like this. And I want it to alternate from this to becoming a full ellipse. And you might be wondering why I did this. Yes. And to avoid this weirdness, the reason this looks like that is that it goes smoothly from this value to this value, but then it just jumps back to this value. It doesn't go smoothly back to the original value. So we can use alternate to fix this. And now it's smoother. And it kind of looks like it's dancing, like it's waving or something, but we can make it even better by specifying a positive bottom value. And now it seems like it's jumping. I thought that was pretty cool. Thank you. If we wanted, we could probably make a shadow as well with a pseudo element, but I'm not going to do that on stage. And if you come up with any cool animations about border radius, just using border radius, you could add them here. This is a gallery of animations using one property each. So I have only 2 for a border radius, even though I have so many for transforms, because everybody makes animations about transforms, but nobody makes animations about border radius. So if you come up with anything cool, feel free to add it, as long as it's only border radius. So what we just learned, border radius is animatable. Yay. We can animate between any 2 radiuses, because they all get converted to the same thing. Border radius affects the hit testing area. Oh, I didn't show you that. Basically, if you hover, let's go to our original example here. So if it went the other way, oh, and I need to specify overflow hidden, because I have an object inside. My cursor is acting up. So as you can see, if I'm hovering here, it's not triggering the hover pseudo class. I need to actually hover on the element, which is very different from what we used to emulate border radius before border radius was supported. That's something you cannot do without border radius. If you use something as a background to kind of emulate border radius, it will still, the hit testing area will still be the whole rectangle. And yeah, so we saw what happens with border radius interacting with other CSS properties. But what happens when border radius interacts with JavaScript? And are there any incompatibilities? So for the most part, it works fine between browsers. For the most part, it's the same across browsers. But there's one significant difference. So take a moment to examine this example. We have lots of interesting things here. We have border radiuses that don't fit, because obviously we have 100% for the top left corner, and then 2ems for this corner. But 100% plus anything doesn't fit, so it needs to be scaled down. Also, we have ems, but the browser needs to convert them to pixels, all sorts of things. So assume we're using a bit of JavaScript. We're getting a reference to our element and putting it on this variable. And then we're getting the computed style, and we're querying border top left radius. Remember, you cannot get the computed style for shorthands. Border radius is a shorthand, so it shouldn't exist and get computed style. If it does, it's a bug. It does in many browsers, but it's a bug. So we're getting the border top left radius, which from here, it's 100%. And remember, percentages resolve to different values horizontally and different vertically, unless our element is a square. So what do you expect browsers to return here? Raise your hand if you expect browsers to return 100%. And raise your hand if you expect browsers to convert it to pixels and return whatever horizontal and vertical pixels this resolves to. I wonder what the rest of you think that didn't raise your hand in either of those two. So yeah, most of you think that it's going to return pixels. That would be useful, wouldn't it be? Unfortunately, most browsers return 100%. And that's actually what they're supposed to return. That's the computed value. It's only Firefox that returns something useful. But Firefox that's actually a bug. Because that's the used value. That's not the computed value. And that's also why I'm using Firefox for these slides. because I needed to get the actual values back. And let's try to get border top right radius, which in this case is 2m, but also it will be scaled down. Because remember, 100% plus 2m's does not fit, so both of them need to be scaled down. So how many of you think assuming our font size here is 16 pixels, how many of you think it will return 32 pixels? Or whatever it resolves to. I don't remember what the font size is actually. I think it's 40 pixels actually. But how many think it will just return whatever 2m's resolve to without having scaled it down? How many of you think it will return 2m? And how many think it will return pixels but actually scale down used pixels? Okay. So most browsers return 80 pixels. Our font size was 40 pixels. So this is what our font size, this is what m's resolve to without any scaling down. Firefox will return 53 point something, which is what it actually uses. And this is a much more useful value. But again, Firefox is wrong here. Firefox is against the specification here. So I expect that might be fixed anytime soon for a certain definition of fixed, because I think that's much better. So what did we just learn? There are incompatibilities in get computed style and border radius. Who would have expected incompatibilities between browsers? Wow. Firefox converts percentages to pixels. All other browsers just report percentages. When the radius does not fit in the box, Firefox reports the scaled down sizes that it's actually using. All other browsers report specified sizes, which is what we specified before any scaling down happened. And before I finish this talk, let's take a peek into the future. Is anything coming for border radius, or it will just stay the way it is? Which it's still pretty cool the way it is, but are we going to be able to do more things with it? So there is a property in CSS backgrounds and borders level 4. Level 4 is still a very, very early draft. It's an editor's draft. Anything in it might change. So this is still very uncertain. It might never happen. It might happen, it might never happen. I will personally try to do my best for it to happen in some way. It's still pretty early, like the name might change or the exact syntax might change, but I'm an editor of that specification, and I will do what I can to make it happen in some form. There is a property called border corner shape. Border corner shape, I didn't come up with that property. Elika Etemad did, but I think it's a very cool idea. Border corner shape will use the values from border radius to create many different shapes. The default shape is curve, which is what border radius does today. But there will also be scoop, which does the sort of inner border radius. And notch, which will do like an inner rectangle kind of thing. And it will even follow border any values of border radius. So you can do crosses and stuff. And there's also bevel, which I think is the coolest value, because it allows you to do all sorts of stuff that's so difficult today. So by just specifying 50%, you can do a rhombus. How would you do a rhombus with CSS today? You can, but it's a mess. Or you could do a hexagon, or you could do a triangle. Think of how we're making triangles today and how we'll be able to make them in the future with just two properties. Or we can make trapezoids. How are we making trapezoids today? Pseudo-elements with borders and different borders, and it's a mess. And in the future, it will be just two properties. And we'll be able to specify them with many, many different kinds of values. And it will be useful for all sorts of things. Page turn effects, for one. Anything. But this is going to take a long time to come. This is actually pretty cool. I can see that the tweets people are tweeting like real time. So this will take a long time to come. I don't understand them, though, because they're in Portuguese, but I can still see people are tweeting. This will take a long time to come. I mean, even the specification is at an early stage now. So first, the specification needs to advance, and the feature needs to be thought out better. And the name should probably change, because this is a horrible name. So that will take a long time. What can we do until then? If we want to make like this sort of shape, how can we do it in CSS today? It's a bit messy, but we can do it with gradients. And don't freak out if the code seems complicated. It's actually not that difficult. Here I'm using 4 linear gradients for every quarter of my element. And they have the same color, which is why it seems seamless. But if I change the color of one of them, you can see what's happening. Each of them is 1/4 of the element. And it's just an angled gradient. Or purple, whatever. So you can see how this is working. And this is 0, just so I don't have to specify the same value twice. It's exactly the same as if it was 20 pixels. And obviously, if it gets larger, it starts looking like an actual gradient, but we don't want that. So, and this is actually pretty flexible. Like if we want to change the size of one of the corners, we can still do it. And if we want to change the size of all the corners, we can do that as well. We just need to alter 4 values. And yes, the text doesn't wrap, but neither does it with border radius. And we can do the same thing with radial gradients as well. And we can still change sizes and everything. It's not perfect, but it's something that works until we get something better. And you should obviously specify a fallback background, because CSS gradients are supported in pretty much every browser today except I9 and below. So for I9 and below, users will see this. Well, basically this, something without the background stuff. It still works in most cases. Like, in most cases, this is just decoration. Websites can live without it. And people are upgrading to I10 very, very much these days. So this has been a long talk, and it's about to end. So there have been many things I showed in this talk, and you might feel that you just forgot everything. First off, don't panic. My slides are online. So if you kept notes throughout this talk, that wasn't very useful. Well, of course, the slides are interactive, so the code I wrote is not there. But you can also look at these resources. This is the spec, and these are two entries in webplatform.org, which is W3C's documentation effort with many other companies. And the slides are here. So if there's one thing you need to write, you need to take notes for, is the URL of the slides. And I'm not sure if we have time for questions, but there's one question I get a lot, and that's how did you make your slides? So these days I just preemptively answer that question. My slides were built with Open Web Technologies. They're using a slideshow framework I wrote. It's on GitHub. The illustrations here, like the grass and the sky here, or Mr. Border Radius's face, these are built with SVG. The little animations in Mr. Border Radius's face were with Smile. CSS animations are eventually going to work with SVG. They work today as well, but you can't do lots of stuff with them. So if you want to animate stuff in SVG files, you have to do it with Smile. It has horrible syntax. It's scary. But it works eventually, even though it takes you like hours to get it right. And the two equations I had were built with MathML, which is an XML-like language for equations, and can be embedded in HTML5 files. So here's the URL of the slides again, if you didn't get to note it before. And these are some places you can contact me. This is my website. This is my Twitter handle. This is my old email, actually. But it still works. You'll just get a message back saying, this is my new personal email, but your email will still be forwarded. My personal email is lea@verou.me. Actually, I should probably change this. Yep, that's better. So thank you.